You see a seafood label with a country of origin, but you don't really know where that fish came from. Behind every fishing vessel is a story, and sometimes a shell company. Oceana uncovered a hidden world where thousands of industrial fishing ships fly one flag, but answer to another. Flags of convenience, foreign ownership, and zero transparency have become business as usual on the high seas. This isn't just paperwork. It's a system that enables illegal fishing and drains wealth from coastal communities. When 62% of vessels lack ownership info, who is responsible for what happens at sea? Some nations like Panama and Belize host fleets they don't even control. But there's a movement growing to demand transparency, accountability, and fairness in global fisheries. In today's episode, we uncover the truth behind the flag and what needs to change. Because protecting the ocean starts with knowing who's really behind the wheel. We're going to discuss this and more on this episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Let's start the show. Hey everybody, welcome back to another exciting episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin. This is the podcast where you find out what's happening with the ocean, how you can speak up for the ocean, and what you can do to live for a better ocean by taking action. And on today's episode, I am very delighted to welcome Oceana's Dr. Daniel Scarrett. He's part of their research team for their global fisheries unit. And this is going to be one you're going to want to watch. This is going to be one you're going to want to listen to if you're watching this on YouTube or listening to this on your favorite podcast app. We're going to be talking about this report that came out in May of 2025 of this year called Beyond the Flag State Paradigm. It's Beyond the Flag State Paradigm, reconstructing the world's large-scale fishing fleet through corporate ownership analysis. What we're going to be talking about is all the things that corporations and that the fishing fleet get away with. It's going to be really interesting. Daniel breaks it down for us. He talks about what comes out of this report. He talks about the recommendations. We get into it a little bit in terms of the weeds of like, what information is missing? Sometimes just fishing vessel length is missing, and the surprising things of what people can get away with when they're at sea. I think this is an interesting episode where people need to listen and watch very carefully and really understand how complex fisheries is. It's about how we can detangle the complexity of global ocean fisheries. This is what we're going to be talking about in today's episode. I can't wait for you to listen. But before you do, if you want to learn more about how to protect the ocean and be guided to do so, I want you to join The Undertow. It's this new company that I am a co-founder of with two incredible people, Serena and Amanda. And we are here to guide you through on how to protect the ocean better through The Undertow. It's a digital app about the ocean that we're creating. And I can't wait for you to join. There's a waiting list right now because we haven't launched the app, but we're going to be launching the app soon. All you have to do is go to speakupforblue.com/join the undertow. That's speakupforblue.com/join the undertow. Well, after you do that, come back and listen to this episode. It's going to be really interesting. Here's the interview with Dr. Daniel Scarrett talking about the new report from Oceana, Beyond the Flag State Paradigm, reconstructing the world's largest scale fishing fleet through corporate ownership analysis. We're going to get into it. It's going to be a lot of fun. Enjoy the interview, and I'll talk to you after. Hey, Dan, welcome to the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. Are you ready to talk about who owns the fishing vessels?
Absolutely, Andrew. Yeah, happy to be here.
Wonderful. I'm excited because this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. When I first started, when I was like a student, I first started to, learn about fisheries just worldwide. I realized how complex it is. And it's not just something like you have a boat, it's registered to such and such country under such and such company's name, and it's run by a certain captain and blah, blah, blah. And they go out and they get this type of fish and they come back and it's all locked. That's what I think logically should happen. Unfortunately, it doesn't work out completely that way, and it can get quite complex, which makes monitoring fisheries even more difficult. And you work for Oceana. Oceana came out with a report back in May called Beyond the Flag State Paradigm, reconstructing the world's large-scale fishing fleet through corporate ownership analysis. Now, I know that sounds like a long title. We're going to break it all down for you. And then we might go a little beyond, not only beyond the flag, but get into the research because, Dan, you are a researcher. So before we get into all of the report and everything, let's find out more about you, Dan. Why don't you let us know who you are and what you do?
Yeah, cool. I'm Daniel Scarrett. I'm a senior manager of international fisheries at Oceana. As you implied, I'm not a campaigner. I'm a researcher, and I work in Oceana's global science and strategy team. So we support campaigners throughout all our Oceana offices, and also do kind of some novel research like this, the report you talked about. So most of the work I do is on international fisheries, particularly distant water fishing fleets. These are the vessels that fish either in the high seas or away from their home port and in the waters of other countries. So by nature, they're quite difficult, as you said, to manage. And our work is, we try to reveal some of the behaviors and the issues that are related to that kind of fishing fleet.
When, you're at this point in your career now doing this type of work, how did this all begin? Did you expect when you first started out, learning about marine science and marine biology, did you expect to be where you are today?
No. My background was in fisheries ecology,
Right.
and as you said about complexity, right? Like, the ecosystem that all these fishing fleets, rely on and are extracting are insanely complex. And that was my background, was kind of learning about how fish stocks behave, how individual animals behave. And I kind of kept moving further and further away from the animals, through the fishing fleets, and now a lot of the time it's more about kind of politics and corporate power, as we'll get onto. But no, I didn't expect this, but I'm happy that I've kind of followed that thread to the place that I am now. Yeah.
Well, and when I first started out, I was always like, it's all about the animals. It's all about, food webs and animal biology and conservation. So I want to protect, fish and corals and seagrasses and mangroves and all these different types of wonderful habitats that, I learned as I grew up and I saw in these documentaries. And I quickly realized, probably about during my master's degree, I quickly realized that if we want to manage, and of course I've confirmed this with a number of other researchers and colleagues, that if we want to manage fisheries, if we want to manage the ocean properly, we have to manage the people. And Dr. Ed Hines Ozon is the one who really kept that. He told me that one time, and I was like, that is probably, the mantra of conservation. At what point did you realize, first, do you agree with that? And also, and if you do, at what point did you realize that was really what we needed to focus on?
Yeah, no, I mean, I do agree with that. I think, I having said that, I think without my kind of fisheries background, that fisheries science background, I wouldn't be able to do what I do as well. I don't think. I think understanding that kind of the biological aspect of it, because that impacts the societal, the way these fishing fleets behave. Right, they follow currents and they follow the fish. So I think that there's a fundamental necessity, as you said, to kind of understand the ecology and the biology beneath it. But I think I first realized about, as you say, that fisheries management is probably as much about managing people as it is about fish. When I first started working with fishers and directly going on fishing boats and, kind of realizing, every day they're out, they're making these kind of decisions exactly where to fish, how to fish. And different parts of the fishing fleet and fishing vessels within that are behaving differently, right? Like they're not going out on this kind of 9 to 5, logging in, fishing in a particular area, coming home. Like, there's kind of behavioral strategies between the different individuals, and kind of realizing that human aspect of fisheries and the individuality of those people, just as you have in fish, I guess, really kind of triggered that for me, of realizing like the people are as important as the fish. But ultimately, it starts by trying to conserve the fish. Without the fish, there isn't the jobs. So, you have to conserve the fish to have the jobs, that rely on them.
Yeah, it's such a dependable relationship, when you really think about it, and having that understanding. Because when I first got into it, I was all about stock assessments, and I'm like, this is where the bulk of the data lies, and it's a very important part of the data. And you have worked, before we press record, you were telling me you've worked in Canada, so you know a little bit of the history of stock assessments, and the role it plays in really understanding the dynamics of how fisheries are doing and assessing how fisheries are doing, and how sometimes politicians don't listen to the stock assessment biologists and it has, consequences to that. We're looking at the cod fishery in the early 90s and so forth, and the recovery from that. And even to this day, it seems like politicians are still not listening to the scientists.
And I would say it works all in, between all three of those, between the scientists, the government and the fishers. One of my favorite books that I would recommend for anyone who's into fishery science is Fishing for Truth, right? Which is all about the cod collapse in Eastern Canada. And kind of that talked about how, scientists as well weren't listening to fishers, who weren't listening to, there was a miscommunication, and the end result was this collapse of one of the biggest fisheries ever, I think.
Yeah.
And still is, in many parts isn't recovered. So, I would recommend that book to understand the importance of people in the fisheries. And sadly, not only did the people lose out, but, in this case, the fish stock as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. How do you find... I know you've been following. You followed everything that's happened since, and you were involved here in Canada for a bit. How do you find that's changed, not only in Canada but worldwide, in terms of what we've learned from that consequence, that collapse of the cod fishery to now? Like, do you find the relationship between that triangle, as you mentioned, like the fishers, the politicians, the scientists, just the people in general, has improved in terms of communication, or do you think it's still similar as it was in the early 90s or even 80s?
I don't think it's quite the same. I'd love to be really positive here.
Be truthful. That's what it's all about, right?
But sadly, there's many fish stocks, as in Canada, as there are here in the UK and in our waters, that are still overfished, right? They're still actively being overfished as well, and not just in an overfished state. So I wouldn't say that we've made it, but I do think there's a lot more understanding of that need for communication. Like, there is a lot more, importance put on the need for kind of consultation, for having those voices. I think the issue might be, how do you then, those conversations may be happening, maybe not to a sufficient extent. I think the issue is still, how do we really implement that into, our stock assessments, how we set catches and things like that. I know in Canada at the moment, there's a big kind of discussion as well about how to bring in industry and First Nation, these different ways of thinking about how we should manage fish stocks. And I think a really good start is having those conversations, knowing it needs to be done. I'm sure there are great examples where it is happening, and we could talk about, and there are obviously bad examples where it absolutely isn't happening. So I think we are progressing, but obviously that kind of golden standard of fishery science is still is still elusive across every fishery that we look at.
Yeah, definitely something that needs to be improved upon, and I think it will always need to be improved upon. There's a lot of stuff going on in the dynamics between almost the different silos of those aspects that we discussed. The science, the politicians, and fishers, indigenous fishers. There are definitely some conflicts in Canada and worldwide, that we could highlight here for days. That's probably an entire separate podcast, not even episode, but just podcast itself on the evolution of that type of conflict, as well as hopefully resolution in the future, and more resolutions. There are some great examples, and there are some awful examples as well. But we're here to talk about I don't want to get. I go on tangents, and I apologize, but it's really interesting when because we talk about people managing fisheries is what we really focus on a lot of the times, and that seems to be your focus. How did that transition happen in your career, where you started to see that light, where it's like, okay, no, we need to start looking at how fishing vessels and fisheries are managed in general, from the vessel aspect, like who's fishing where, what are the policies around that, what's the international and national laws around that? How did that transition happen for you?
I guess it was quite abruptly, actually. So after I'd finished my PhD and first postdoc, which, as I said, was all about ecology and behaviours of shellfish, actually lobsters in particular, I went and worked for a consultancy firm in London, MRAG, and we were doing a lot of evaluation for the European Commission as well as UK government. And, to start with, a lot of that work was around setting tax and quotas. But obviously a lot of that was also not just how do we set that tack and the total allowable catch and the quotas to catch that, but then how is it being catched? Who is catching it? And, actually measuring kind of the catch against what we've said is allowed to be caught is completely reliant on who's being allocated it, where they're getting that fish, where they're going and catching that tack, and the trade of that. So when I started doing a lot more policy evaluation for the commission, a lot more of it was focused on that side of it, the policy of, of how do we implement this with the people rather than the fishery science, which was so often fed in kind of, externally by ICES actually in that case.
Right. It's an interesting matter because I remember growing up here and listening to the news, and I forget when it actually happened, but it must have been in the 90s. And it was, going back to cod, there was a news piece that was on how there were foreign fishing vessels fishing at the border of our exclusive economic zone in Canada, and they were fishing for cod. And it got to the point where we sent out, Canada, the government of Canada sent out Coast Guard vessels to intercept them and to basically chase them off and to arrest them if they were in our waters. And I think that was the first time where I was like, wow, so people are coming across the Atlantic. These were European vessels across the Atlantic, fishing for cod, and they're not allowed to, and they're still doing it. And then you start to think about, as I started to go through university, you hear more and more about illegal fisheries and how difficult it is to monitor, how difficult it is to stop the illegal fisheries from happening. You can't be out on a vessel. Enforcement's difficult, and I learned how more and more how complex it became. Can you talk about? Let's get into the report a bit, but just the overall where the fishing vessel sort of research is at to this point. Can you give the audience a bit of an overview of the report, and especially just in the context of where we're at in understanding how fishing vessels are managed worldwide?
Yeah, yes, and as you said at the beginning, again, the complexity of this is complexity runs through fisheries, right?
Yeah.
Completely, and it's same in when I talk about these fishing vessels. There's a whole diversity of fishing vessels, the gear they use, the size of them, how they operate. As I say, I tend to work on the largest of these fishing vessels, these distant water fishing vessels. And managing and understanding them is really difficult because by their nature, they're hard to govern. They operate really far distances from their home port. They may not even go back to their home port for many years at a time because they can transship, they can offload their catch at sea to another vessel and continue fishing. They can be resupplied, refueled. So they're away for long periods of time, often fishing in the high seas or in the waters of other countries. And by their very nature, they're very transient. They can be following, in the case of tuna stocks, they could be following these fish all around whole oceanic basins. And so that makes them really hard to observe, even harder to kind of control and understand. Technology, I know you've had colleagues from Global Fishing Watch recently.
Yep.
Technology is making it a lot easier to understand that, to be able to observe those at-sea activities. But, still identifying wrongdoing is one thing. Actually holding those people to account and actually making sure, the punishments are kind of handed down and are appropriate and are large enough to prevent that activity happening again in the future. That's the difficult bit. That's the bit where technology is helping, but we really need better policy and better enforcement of these regulations. And to bring it to the report, the reason, beneficial ownership comes into that is that often when these vessels are caught doing illegal fishing, if there is any punishment, it's usually the crew or the skipper, those who actually have the least kind of power or maybe benefit from these situations,
Right.
from the fishing enterprise. They're often the ones that are punished, while, the owners or the managers kind of get away with it. Those crew can be quite easily replaced. Crewing is now a global sector where crew can be flown around or shipped around from anywhere to replace these crew. Skippers can be easily replaced. The vessel can be renamed, reflagged to another country, and it goes out the next week and continues fishing, And I think that's the big issue here is, these operations, especially these multi-jurisdictional international fishing vessels, they seem to be able to kind of get away with some of these fishing breaking fishing rules and regulations.
Yeah.
So it's complicated. I hope that answered your question.
No, it's perfect.
Quite a lot.
One thing I was thinking as you were mentioning that, I was thinking of like an analogy to that is, when it's almost like organized crime, and sometimes in some cases we discover it is, yeah. But it's almost like organized crime where they quote unquote employ children under the age of a certain age, so that when they get caught doing the petty crimes that help fund this organized crime, they get less punishment. They go to jail, but they get out a lot sooner because the punishment is less. And I think the same thing you can say depending on where they get caught in terms of the fishing vessels. The crew, the skipper, and sometimes the crew is not even supposed to be on that ship. They're what we call fishery slaves, but they get less of a punishment than what the owners should get. But because you can never really find the owners, it's difficult when you look at the paper trail of who owns what. I covered a story a number of years ago on this podcast. This has been running for about 10 years, this podcast, but I remember this story where we talked about a fishing vessel that was notorious for being reflagged, renamed, and caught again, and then reflagged, renamed, and then just went around the world, and people were trying to catch it, and when they did, they could not figure out who owned it. It was like it'd be like bounty. It was like one of those Mission Impossible style shows, but fishing related, because it became that complex, and there were a lot of players that some were okay and some were illegal and part of organized crime, and it was like an untangled web, and you just sit there and you're like, how is this like where we've come to, where it becomes even more complex to break down these webs and these chains of who owns these fishing vessels. And then you look at sort of the infrastructure of how this is done, and including this report, like just some of the highlights of this report, I'll just kind of name, like we like the legal ownership of like information for 62% of the vessels is missing. That's over the majority. So 1 in 6 vessels are legally owned in a country different from their state flag. So we'll talk about that, but actually let's talk about that now. What does that mean? So like you have a flag like that you fly on the ship, but then the owner could be in another country. How can they get away with putting a flag up from a different country if the owner in, say, the U.S. or Canada or the UK or other countries?
Yeah, I mean, reflagging a vessel is all legal and above board. This has happened for decades. I think initially in the merchant navy, merchant
right.
shipping would use these reflag maybe to be able to enter ports more easily, things like that. So they get away with it because it's legal. The issue we have often is, particularly with flag states, is that there's not always the same regulation or threshold for entry to be flagged to a nation. So if I had a boat or we had a boat together and we wanted to get it flagged in the US, there would be a lot of legal thresholds for us to meet in order for us to be able to fly that flag. We also have at the other end of the scale what we call these open registries or flags of convenience, and this is where it can become a bit of an issue because the threshold for entry can be a lot lower. So you may not need any economic kind of tie to that country. You may not even have ever had to set foot in that country. But the register that you can register your vessel on is open. So you'll pay some kind of fee, and then you can go in there and I can get the flag of Panama or Belize, for example. And that allows me then to fish under that state's jurisdiction. That state is then legally in charge of all the regulatory and social conditions on my fishing vessel. And if they have much lower rules than, say, the US do, who might want to inspect my fishing vessel, ensure that working conditions are good for my crew. If the other flag where I've gone, this flag of convenience, don't have that, it means that there's the opportunity for me to get away with not meeting those regulatory kind of thresholds. Doesn't mean that everyone who's using a flag of convenience is lowering their standards. it means that they're allowed to. It's an opportunity for them to reduce standards for safety, for how they're fishing, for the control and monitoring of that vessel.
Now, and with that, it says just 10 countries legally own more than half of the fleet, for which data is available. So what does that mean? Like, we're looking at ownership concentration.
Yeah. This is a really, I feel like this is increasing in the literature, this issue, mainly because of the state of fisheries at the moment, I think, as well, and also just ocean economy broadly is massively expanding. So there's corporate interests in expanding into the ocean and investing into the ocean and get a return on investment. So we kind of chatted before we filmed about this idea, or people might have a vision of the fishing industry as these localized fishing vessels going out maybe for the day, really early in the morning, catching some fresh fish and bringing it back to market. And that certainly is the case for the majority, actually, of fishing boats around the world. But there's also this kind of part of the industry that is heavily financialized, heavily invested in, in order to make profit. That's the main goal. It's it's not a pastime or it's a livelihood as such. And this is these corporate actors that are coming in, and we see concentration of ownership for a few reasons. It might be due to the fact that, for example, when a fishery is overfished and there's less fish to catch, and you've got 100 boats that maybe are catching that stock. If their catch is, what they're allowed to catch is reducing because the fish stock is overfished, it becomes much more difficult for them to turn a profit. And so we often see, people leaving the industry for that reason. And that's when you can get consolidation. You can also get consolidation just when there's so much power starts being concentrated. They essentially have the money and the means to be able to buy out other people from the fishing industry. And so, consolidation isn't, or this this concentration of ownership isn't inherently bad, but we need to be able to understand, how bad it is in order for essentially the public to make a call. Like, do we want our fish in the UK to be exploited by a handful of corporations, or do we want it to be spread out between more people?
That's really stopping them. And I mean, we've seen other corporations, here in Canada, we see the telecommunications, monopoly of like, 2 or 3 companies who pretty much set the standard and don't allow other companies to come in because it's competition for them. They get involved in government, they get more power and stuff. And that happens across industries, including the fishing industry. They want to keep that power. They want to keep that money to themselves. They don't want other players to come in. But then if they make a decision that is not right for the ecosystem, for that fishery, for whatever reason, whether it be more money, more power, that could really turn quickly, as we've seen in other industries. So is that essentially the worry, the concern or at least one of the concerns? Yeah,
for sure. That when you get these really dominant firms, there's, there is the ability for them to firstly exercise that market power. So because they're earning such excess profits, or can be earning excess profits, it allows them to almost be able to set the price, potentially suppress wages or weaken livelihood opportunities for other fisher. Again, I'm not saying this is what happens. I'm just saying that is a theoretical. This is what we see in economic theory. The second thing is they're able to shape the actual conditions of the food system itself, so they can be determining, what types of, how is this fish processed? What is it? Because they have such control over the market, they can determine what are the products, what's the quality of that product that's being fed into the market, because they essentially, end up can monopolize this market. And then the third one, as you alluded to, that these dominant firms can kind of, a concern on it is that excess political power, that ability to not only shape the economics or the physical reality of these food systems, but also the policies. If you have that much power, and as you said, in other systems, we see this a lot. Probably a little less in fisheries, but it definitely happens, right? Like, we definitely know that there are lobbying. I mean, and so that's the part of the issue is the distribution of power. you know, and that can result as a concentration of that access or ownership.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Really interesting. Let's talk about registries here. The one of the highlights that really stood out to me, Panama, Belize, Honduras top the list of flagging vessels legally owned by foreign corporations. Why these countries? Is it just because of the standards that they have? Maybe it's easier to own vessels in that country with that flag, as you mentioned earlier, in terms of like maybe they can get away with a little bit more. They have a little bit more flexibility than other countries.
Yeah, I mean, these, particularly Panama, this is, you know, I guess a political decision to be a flag that allows other, you know, organizations, companies from different countries to flag to them. You know, it can bring in quite a lot of foreign currency, which can be a really good thing to help, you know, develop the country. Obviously, Panama is intrinsically linked to fishing, right? With the Panama Canal. So,
of course,
a lot of this is kind of historical as well and stuff. But yeah, the openness of the ability to have an open, or the presence of that open registry leads them to be, you know, the key flag state. So Panama, Belize, Honduras, Liberia as well, for example, they're big flag states in merchant shipping as well. Fishing obviously has kind of just followed suit. So
of course,
I don't think it's necessarily, and cruise ships as well, actually, in the case of, I think, Panama and Belize. And so it's that the threshold to entry is much lower. And so, you know, and also it can be, some of these flag states can offer kind of more different incentives. So some of them may be lower registration fees. Some of them may be anonymity, right? So in Panama, we all probably heard about the Panama Papers that were released and certainly hit the UK in the news very heavily. You know, so that level of anonymity can also be quite attractive to corporations. And then, as you said, that potentially lower regulations in terms of, you know, crewing regulations or working conditions, or maybe even the monitoring of what they're doing at sea.
Yeah, sorry. Can you just go into a little bit more detail of that news that came out that hit Britain a little bit with the anonymity?
Yeah, so I'm not across the story completely, but the Panama Papers was essentially a leak of I think thousands of kind of registered corporations and people that had registered accounts in Panama, and it kind of showed like who they were, what income they were getting, and you know, there was quite a few, if I remember at the time, politically you know, involved people were on this list. You know, it was basically a big leak and that led to a lot of these discussions, particularly on beneficial ownership. In fact, in Europe, of, you know, especially if you're a politician, but for, you know, these people is what do you own where in the world? You know, because part of this of knowing these owners is also from a government perspective, being able to, you know, levy them and tax them appropriately, because you know, that's an issue, particularly in the EU, is if you don't know what investments and interests they own, it becomes very difficult to know, you know, what's a fair taxation for these people. And where where is their money being invested elsewhere in the world?
And then is it, you know, on the up and up too, you know, if that money's being invested is where it's going. Transparency is such a big key that gets lost in a lot of these things. When we talk about, you know, concentrations and what countries hold a lot of the flag ownership and so forth, we look at impacts on those states, on those coastal states, and how, you know, this type of work impacts those. So, like, for instance, like, how does opaque ownership, like, reduce revenue and enforcement capacity for some of these coastal nations?
Yeah, so for the coastal nations, as we talked about before, you know, a big part of it for enforcement is knowing who's accountable for that vessel. As I said, you know, you might find a vessel doing some illegal fishing, and you can stop it. And, you know, at that point, all you have is the crew and you know, the people on the boat, and that's not always sufficient to prevent that boat from being able to continue in the future. And then, I mean, one of the other issues is, you know, if I'm a coastal state and vessels are coming to fish in my water or wanting to flag to that, not knowing who they are means I don't really know the background of them. I don't know what other fisheries they're involved with, whether they've had broken the rules elsewhere, whether this vessel that's come in to fish here now has fished in all these other coastal states and maybe has been kicked out of them. I don't know that if I don't know who the owner is and what other interests they're connected to. And I think that's a big part of it as well is knowing who they are, because and the risks involved. It's hard to do a full risk assessment if I don't know who the companies and the people are behind this fishing vessel.
Do you have like a specific like real world example of something that's happened, where like these coastal nations kind of paid the price, or we're starting to see this type of action happening in a coastal nation?
Not off the top of my head, but okay. I will give a good example of, I think the difficulties that not just coastal states, but anyone involved in fisheries enforcement have, is this example of a policy brief that I collaborated with my colleagues in Oceana Europe with, I think it was about 6 months ago, about this series of vessels all owned by one company. They're all named after different whales. There was like, the fin whale, the right whale. I can't remember. There's about 6 of these vessels, and we kind of did all this analysis looking at where have they been fishing. Many of them had been, caught illegally fishing in the past. And we looked at their history of ownership and flagging and where they'd been fishing. Ownership had changed between different EU member states to Russia, back to EU member states, and where they were flagged to, had no connection to who owned them or where they were fishing. And we wrote this report kind of saying, there's some kind of link to an EU member state here. This is worrying. And by the time we gave the company notice, just to make sure we're writing about this company, they should have notice. About a week later, when we actually launched the report, the day before, all these vessels were reflagged. And so the report was instantly out of date. And that just shows you how quickly these vessels can move. You think you've got them pinned, and then suddenly they're reflagged somewhere else. And so if you're working with the flag state where they are now, trying to, get them, hold them to account for some of their previous actions, suddenly they're based on the other side of the world by the time you're actually trying to get some movement. So, the speed at which this happens is quite surprising. These vessels can almost disappear, like a magic trick, reappear.
It's fascinating in a way. You got to give them their respect in terms of how quickly they can maneuver. They've obviously seen this happen before, and they've been able to overcome it. How do we, as people who want to manage fisheries better, how do we prevent this from happening? Like, what's the mechanism that we, as people who, scientists and conservationists and people all around the world, like, it doesn't matter what country you live in, like, we can't let this happen. How do we stop this type of behavior?
Yeah. I mean,
right. That's the question at hand, I guess.
I know. If I knew, I mean, I'd be out of work tomorrow if we answered it. But I think it's incredibly complex, right? I think there's multiple parts at which we need better policies, better regulations, and better implementation of them. So, at the flag state level, when a vessel is being flagged to your country, to your flag, to fly your flag, is to ensure that you're collecting that information. Okay, I want to know the beneficial owner. So that's the individual human at the top of that ownership change. Because we haven't even talked about that, actually, the fact that it's not just one company and a person. There can be a network of companies, shell companies. So at the flag state level, it's okay, you want to flag I need to know who are the people behind this. Show me, I need to know all that kind of ownership chain behind you before you can even be registered. Then ideally these flag states ought to make that information public, or to the extent that they're able to. Then there's the coastal states. That's where these vessels then go fishing. And again, that's another opportunity to say, you have license to now come and fish our waters and take some of our fish. To do that, here's some thresholds you have to meet, some standards you have to meet. Yeah. And again, one of those could be, we want to know the history of your fishing, where you fished for the last 6 months, for say, like some VMS tracking data. Yep. And as well, who are your owners, and what other vessels do they own? What what are the risks involved of us allowing your vessel to come and enter our waters and take our publicly owned resource? You know,
Yeah.
so there's there as well. And then there's also the market state. So once that fish ultimately that fish is worthless until it comes to land, until it's landed and actually sold. And so through the port state, that's where they land the fish, and then the market state where that fish is eventually sold for consumption. You know, you can bring in regulations there, like trying to trace that fish. Like, can you show me who caught it, and that ownership chain?
Yeah.
So that there's many places, and again, this is why it makes it hard, because
Of course,
if any of those places there's a weak link, you know,
it's all
you fall foul. Yeah.
Yeah, and then of course everybody's going to go and get their ship flagged in that state, because that's where it's easier. It's it's very similar to when we look at fisheries, the actual fisheries and the supply chain of those fisheries. I think the Marine Stewardship Council has been pretty adamant about tracking where from the point of catch all the way to the point of sale, of how, like, let's track who's involved in that supply chain, so it makes it more transparent. You can tell which fish is there. You can decrease I guess the number of times there's fraud, like fisheries fraud, as Oceana reports a number of years ago highlighted, where I think in some cases in Toronto is like 48% of the fish were fraudulent, depending on the fish, and which is scary. Like, if you try to buy something that's sustainable, but it's not the fish that you think you're buying, which is an unsustainably caught fish, you just unknowingly participate in this kind of action. It's almost like we need the same thing for the ownership of the vessels. Like, just making sure that we can track and it's like take away these shell companies, and it's like, owner, all right, here's the owner, this is the vessel that they own, here's where they have all their flagged vessels, and do they have a good rapport in one country compared to another country? And if they don't, maybe they should pay for that by not being able to flag a vessel in another country, and they're just able to flag in one or two countries and be monitored specifically for that action. I think that's is that, like, I feel like that's a fair and transparent way of tracking these vessels. It doesn't have to be available to the public, but to some of these organizations, like maybe Oceana or somebody like that, where they can actually track this type of I guess business chain, of who owns these vessels.
Yeah, that's the goal.
Yeah.
We campaign at Oceana and many of our NGO colleagues for publicly disclosed ownership databases. That is what we want. That is our gold standard, to have beneficial ownership of EU flagged vessels at the minimum in the EU to be publicly available. Then for these member states to make their citizens and their companies registered there to also disclose what financial interests or other interests they have in other countries, and for that to be publicly disclosed. But we know that some countries do collect this information, but maybe don't share it. We also know that in some countries, different government departments might collect this information and don't then share it with the fisheries ministry or the fisheries authorities. So there's an issue of the data either not existing. When it does exist, there's an issue of it not being shared properly. And then we have this issue of the data not aligning. So, the definition of a beneficial owner or how we identify that ownership doesn't match up. So, this makes it really difficult for outsiders, as it were, like myself, who want access to this, to understand it better, to try and communicate that to the public. Often we pay other organisations who collect this information. So even the information used in this report isn't technically public information because it's behind a paywall.
Right.
So and it's not a small paywall. It's quite significant. So it's not available to the majority of people. Majority of people in a country can't find out who the owners of these fishing vessels are that are fishing this publicly owned resource. And again, this isn't to say there aren't examples of where we're seeing improvement. Obviously I tend to focus on the worst examples,
of course,
because that's where we're trying to get the most improvement, right?
Right, of course. Yeah, if you can get the improvement for that, then you're already increasing, the level of efficiency and protection. This is a big report. It's an important report. For my audience, like, what were the big, policy recommendations in this report and policy brief?
Yeah, so the main one, as I was alluding to earlier about how do we try and fix this, is for flag states to collect beneficial ownership information, or at least, this report we focused on what we call the legal owners, which is the corporations. The beneficial owners are usually the shareholders, the humans at the top of that chain. So it's for flag states to collect that information, when they license a vessel or when they renew a license, and to ensure that information is kept up to date. As we said earlier, this can change so quickly, right? So for flag states to collect that and ideally make that publicly available. For the companies themselves to disclose to their states of incorporation. So that's where those companies are based. Mm-hmm. Those countries should be asking their companies to tell them, like, what do you own? What investments do you have around the world? Because it'd be good to know that. It'd be good to know if we have a citizen that's investing in, fishing off of Namibia or in the Pacific Islands.
Right.
I think as well, one of the big recommendations is just for there to be a lot more effort in kind of sharing information, understanding these systems. What do we know? What are you doing in your authorities and your enforcement agencies? Can you share that with other enforcement agencies so that so that everybody's brought up to that standard? Because we know the EU have one of the, most sophisticated systems for trying to stop IUU in the world. And, still, they have to get it right 100% of the time. The IUU fishers only have to get it right once, right?
Right. Right.
Can they kind of share this knowledge and training with other coastal states to try and improve the overall system? And then the final thing we kind of in the report we suggested was around ensuring that all large-scale fishing vessels have a unique identifying number. So ideally an IMO number. This is the International Maritime Organization. And this is a number that's unique to a fishing vessel, regardless of if they, repaint it, rename it, reflag it, or the ownership changes. It stays with that fishing vessel. In the US and Canada and the UK, they're the only place I've had cars. We have a VIN, right? A vehicle identification number, and it's like hammered into the chassis of your car. So it'd be similar to that. So regardless of what modifications and what happens to that boat is identifiable throughout its lifetime. And then connected to that in the IMO registry, I think we believe they should be then asking for ownership information. And of course, just with a car, when that VIN exchanges the slips, the ownership. You have to report that, right? You just can't buy a car and go driving it the next day.
No, yeah.
But you can buy a fishing vessel and start going to, fishing the next day.
Unreal. It's
a little bit more complicated than that, but simply that's the way. It's like identify these fishing vessels and have that linked to ownership.
Absolutely. That makes sense to me. All of this makes sense to me. Obviously, not as easy to implement as we hope, but hopefully we can get there with the added pressure of reports like these to say, hey, this is what's happening. You guys, we all need to know about this, and we need to start putting pressure on people. As a researcher, I'm curious, what was the most surprising reveal that you have come across when creating a report like this or contributing to a report like this? Like for you, out of all of these items that we discussed, what was the most surprising for you, like that you uncovered?
Yeah, that's a really good question, actually. I think some of the surprises I thought might happen. The surprise was maybe the scale. So in terms of data gaps, we knew there were going to be data gaps. The data was going to be patchy and imperfect. I didn't know there would be to this level. Some of these vessels that we were trying to identify in the IMO registry didn't even have information like the length of it. Which surely is quite a standard piece of information. Yeah. How big is this boat was not available for all these vessels. And obviously the ownership information being missing for 2/3 of the fishing fleet was quite surprising. There was a few, I think, surprises that, and of course I work on international and global fisheries, but I can't have a knowledge of all these different coastal states. And was a few surprises, like Argentina popping up as like having quite high proportions of foreign ownership of its fishing fleet. And I think that would be kind of a historical, there was a lot of Spanish ownership, for example, there. And probably also access to some of the fish stocks that are in that part of the world for particular companies and fishing fleets. So there was a few surprises like that popped up, and there was a few individual cases. I quite liked looking at individual vessels.
Of course,
I love this high level information, but it's those individual little stories of like a vessel that's like, registered here, flagged there, fishing here. And we did an EU specific policy brief that went into a bit more detail on these individual vessels. We kind of made passports for them and had all these stamps of where they'd gone and fished and how the ownership changed. So I think they're the ones that I find maybe the most surprising. Is you're finding links between, as I said, Europe, Russia, and the US and West Africa, and it's just, how does that happen? Like how are these humans involved that have these investments and connections in all these places? And we're just looking at this data, this kind of paper trail, but obviously these are all deals or purchases and exchanges that happened. And I think they're the ones that kind of surprised me the most, with those individual little stories that I'd love to know more about.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's an interesting idea. How they have, like, you can track animals that are tagged, like fish or sharks or whale sharks and so forth on an app. Imagine if you could track fishing vessels, like individual fishing vessels, and it'd be like, oh, how are they all the way in the Indian Ocean when they started off in the Pacific? Or, and be able to see and almost like it's almost like highlighting them in a surprising way, but a more transparent way, where people can actually see where these fishing vessels go and where they unload and things like that. That would be, I feel like, an interesting app that might highlight some of the nefarious ongoings of some of these vessels and what they're up to. And they probably wouldn't like that app very much, but I think that would be interesting for organizations such as Oceana and even individuals like me, just to be able to, like, oh, this is weird. Like, I'm tracking an individual vessel. There's been some really supposed to happen.
Yeah, there's been some really cool research, on looking at these, because obviously now through Global Fishing Watch, increasingly we can map more vessels. Still by no means all of these vessels. And there's been some really cool research starting to look at that now, like the behaviors of them. And one of my colleagues, Keiko Nomura, looked at how different fleets interact or potentially avoid each other. There can be kind of this, especially for tuna stocks, there can be a collaboration once you find the schools between different fleets. Maybe they have the same owners, we don't know. And then others would fish in completely different areas, like almost like this avoidance. And similarly with fishing in the high seas and these different systems that are out there, we're learning more and more that the high seas isn't just this, blank homogeneous desert, but has these kind of networks of systems and underwater mountains, and seeing how these different vessels, time it so they all arrive at the same time. Yeah, I think this is a really exciting, area of research at the moment. Is looking at this.
Yeah, absolutely. This has been wonderful. My last question that I give people when I interview, especially on things like reports like these, my audience is very motivated to help. They want to help. Sometimes they feel a little bit out of touch in terms of how they can help. This is a big deal. This is a huge undertaking that you and your colleagues have done. How can individuals help? When they listen to this podcast, they're probably like, man, this sucks. Like, all this stuff is happening. There's a lot of problems. There are people who are working on it, but it's like they feel a little helpless, and they want to do more. So from an individual standpoint, how would you recommend people, what actions people can take to help in this area?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I ask myself that a lot as well, even just about, what can I do more than, sometimes publishing a report can feel great, but, what more can I do? I think if there's a campaign, especially if you're in a country that, is a flag of convenience or has a huge fishing industry, trying to support campaigns that are pushing for more transparency or, or better regulation of these fisheries, whether that's, industry led, by these kind of fishing corporations or small scale fishers or different industry bodies, or whether it's led by NGOs or groups, I would say try and support that. They're often trying to get people to, add their names to petitions and send emails and stuff like that. And I think for me, fundamentally, that's the biggest part is, these emails and petitions ultimately they're being sent to the politicians, right? Is in your political power. It feels often increasingly, in fact, that we have very little of it.
Yeah.
But what little we do, we can put to to candidates that maybe think about these issues, and particularly environmental issues. I think that's a really strong way to be able to support these causes, which hopefully that's encouraging and isn't just all right. Well, vote and write emails, but
well, I'll tell you. I mean, it makes a difference. I mean, we have listenership in over 150 different countries. It's not just the UK, it's not just Canada, it's not the US, it's not just Australia or India, Brazil or Argentina, as we mentioned. It's all these different countries. And if we have people that are listening to this in a variety of different countries, then maybe if we all start talking to our representatives on a regular basis and get to know them and build relationships, like it's not just a matter of just writing to it. I feel like it's a matter of like really getting to know and having those representatives get to know you and what's important to you. It may be environmental, it might be for different aspects of what's important to you, but really understanding that relationship between us and our government representatives and getting to know them, whoever they are, whatever side of the aisle they're on, is a big thing, and probably a podcast episode in and of itself, or a series of them in and of itself to get to know. But the work that you and your colleagues are doing, Dan, I think is imperative. We need this information. This information is not found regularly, as you mentioned. It's difficult to track down. Even finding out the length of certain boats is difficult, which is like you would think would be common information, the first information that they would put in, and sometimes it's just not. And so we appreciate all the work that you've done, not only for this report, but in the past, and research into this type of aspect of fisheries. It's very important, and we really appreciate you coming on and sharing all this information with us so that we can have more knowledge to live for a better ocean. So we appreciate your work, and we'd love to have you back on sometime and talk about updates and hopefully seeing some progress in some changes that countries have made in the way they track their fishing vessels.
No, thank you very much for having me on. It's I love talking about this stuff, and so happy to find a fellow person to talk and an audience who are keen to listen.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Wonderful. Thank you so much. We appreciate it.
Cheers, Andrew.
Thank you, Dan, for joining us on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. It was great to have you on. It was great to be able to try and detangle some of the complexities of global fishing vessels and just what they can get away with. It's surprising about what they can get away with. It's surprising that a lot of this has gone on for a long time. What always surprises me is when you try and track down who owns a fishing vessel, it's just like a web. It just goes all over. You can be pinged all over around the world looking at shell companies, and then, depending on where they're from or how it goes at one shell company to another, all over the world. And it's really interesting to me and surprising how people can get away with this for so long. Hopefully this report helps detangle this, and a system is in place to track how vessels are owned and who owns these vessels right to the actual company that makes the revenue from this. And let's be honest, the fishing fleets that are doing illegal things, it's the crew that pays the price, but the companies rarely do. And that's a shame, and that should not happen again. So we are going to, continue to talk about this in the future, but this episode really highlights a lot of the issues that are around and what can be done as recommendations to help get rid of this whole problem. And so I want to thank Dan again for joining us. We're going to put links to Oceana's report in the show notes so you can get access to that. If this is your first time listening to the episode, I'd love for you to subscribe, follow, however you do, whether you're watching this on YouTube or you're listening to this on your favorite podcast app. But I want to thank Dan for joining us, and I want to thank you for listening. I really do appreciate all the support that you've given this podcast. We're getting a lot of views, we're getting a lot of downloads, we're getting a lot of listens, we're getting a lot of comments and engagement. It's always great. And if you want to connect with me, you can do so on Instagram at How to Protect the Ocean, or you can go over to speakupforblue.com/contact, fill out the form there. It goes right to my email and you'll get access to me right away, and I'll try to answer as soon as I can. I want to thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of the How to Protect the Ocean podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Lewin from the True North Strong and Free. Have a great day. We'll talk to you next time, and happy conservation.